Hello, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. Yes, I'm Staffan Müller-Wille and just joined the University of Cambridge. I've spent a lot of time at the University of Exeter before. And let me just get up my slide. Yes, that works nicely. I'm in a little bit of a special situation because I'm coming out of a long-term project on the history or the cultural history of heredity, as we called it, which has spawned numerous publications already, the usual edited volumes that we produce in the humanities, two co-authored volumes, one on heredity, one more specifically on the century of the gene. So I have the feeling that I haven't got anything new to say, really, but I hope it will at least be new to you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to summarize very pointedly some of the main findings of this project on the cultural history of heredity, I'm going to add towards the end a couple of reflections what epigenetics, the epigenetic turn means for our understanding of heredity. The epigenetic turn sort of caught us in the middle of the project, more or less by surprise. We were aware from the beginning of epigenetics. Jablonka and Lamb's classic volume is from, I think, 1995. But we thought heredity was the thing to focus on, and it dawned upon us the more we reached the end of our project that we had actually written quite a selective history. Let me illustrate that first with a famous quotation, or actually the beginning of the novel Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Sterne. I wish either my father or my mother, or indeed both of them, as they were in duty both equally bound to it, had minded what they were about when they begot me. So this reflects a very widespread idea that the conditions of conception, pregnancy, even during the time after birth, weaning, for example, have a profound influence, shape the life of infants. And this is actually an idea that never died out. Historians of biology focus on, when they look at the 19th century, on theories of evolution, on heredity, on genetics when it comes to the 20th century, on molecular genetics when it comes to the late 20th century. But in physiology, endocrinology, psychology, ideas that the environment has a shaping influence, but even the feelings, emotions of parents on the embryo remains widespread. This is epigenetics, of course, in a very wide understanding. I will come back to the more specific current understandings at the end of my talk. Epigenetics in a wider understanding simply meaning everything that lies beyond the genetic. So what about the genetic then? Now, one of the striking things is that when you look at sources before the mid-19th century, heredity is regularly addressed as something that is a bit of a curiosity, if not even a monstrosity, a weird feature, something that doesn't quite fit into the normal scheme of things. So this is a quotation from Michel Montaigne, his essays published in 1580. What monster is it that this tear or drop of seed whereof we are engendered brings with it, and in it the impressions not only of the corporal form, but even of the very thoughts and inclinations of our fathers. Montaigne reflects on this because he develops gallstones at the same age as his father, and also hates, just like his father, physicians that treat him. He finds this odd that this should be transmitted to him from his father, simply for the reason that this seems to be an example for some mysterious, even magical action at a distance. His father is long dead when he writes this and when he develops gallstones. So what kind of influence is this supposed to be? We still find this idea, but taken into an entirely new direction in Darwin when he speaks of inheritance. Darwin defines inheritance in a striking way in his Origin of Species. He does not have a lot to say about this. His variation book is published later, which has a lot of things to say about inheritance. So what he says is that in this little passage about inheritance is that it is something that only strikes us when we see very rare deviations. He says, say, once amongst several million individuals that are then passed on. Why does he do this? Because he thinks that in all other cases, the inheritance, as we would call it, of normal characteristics, normal traits, we can easily assume that the same, as he puts it, original cause acts in the ancestor and the descendant. So only when we have rare deviations, and these are passed on, the probability basically tells us that there must be some special cause for that. So he as well defines inheritance as actually something which is weird and kind of outlier. Now, with Mendel, of course, this becomes even more pronounced, because if we look at his experiments, it becomes clear that he was highly selective, not only in the choice of experimental plants, but also in the choice of characters to work on. He chooses character pairs. He makes sure they are actually inherited, so he pure breeds his experimental plants. And he chooses carefully characters where he sees sort of no interaction and independent inheritance. So his so-called laws are actually highly exceptional, and you have to sort of search for cases in which you can find them. Another way of putting this is that he hits on an experimental system, a factorial system, as R.A. Fisher called it, Mendel's factorial system, a system within the organism that is a kind of randomizing machine, and that allows him to formulate expectations, hypotheses that he then can test, and so on, that allows him to use combinatorics and statistics. So in sum, what I want to say is that from today's perspective, it begins to appear odd, this focus on this one genetic system. And this is mainly because we now, knowledge of these alternative inheritance system has increased considerably in recent decades. We now know of a plurality of inheritance systems, and some of them we characterize as epigenetic, where we have not only intergenerational effects, but intergenerational effects like from methylation patterns that carry on post the second filial generation, so are inherited in a very narrow and strict sense. There's a lot of debate that I'm sure most of you will be familiar about that, about the plurality of inheritance system, extended inheritance as it's sometimes called. There are people who defend a position known as developmental systems, that even the environment in a sense of organisms is inherited, that signals from, especially when there's niche constructions, that signals from the environment can be sort of passed on from one generation to the next. So what to make of this? I want to end with two questions and provide answers to them from my perspective. So the first question, what to make of plurality of inheritance systems? If one thinks biologically about this, I think it is not so surprising that we find a plurality of inheritance systems. I think one simply needs to switch perspective and see that evolutionary adaptation is not a product of a particular inheritance system, the Mendelian one or DNA or whatever, but inheritance systems are products of evolutionary adaptation to a very particular problem that organisms face, namely how to keep a kind of memory of past adaptations to meet future challenges. This is, of course, a very old idea, and it is quite clearly formulated during the Enlightenment already by naturalists like Buffon or Maupertuis. Secondly, heredity came into biology as a metaphor from law, and it applied a very particular model of inheritance. Early geneticists were very aware of this. And we can think of other metaphors or models from the range of ways in which human cultures have, in fact, responded to the above problem themselves. We can speak of transference. That is the language Mendel, interestingly, speaks. A lot of people have emphasized he didn't use terms of inheritance, but he speaks in terms of transference, Übertragung in German. Or succession is another example, succession from from sons succeeding their father in their social position and similar models. Second question, why do genetic inheritance systems enjoy such a privileged status in biology so far? Or perhaps one now has to say, until recently. I characterized Mendel's discovery as hitting upon a randomizing mechanism. And this, of course, allowed him to calculate or manipulate his organisms in a calculated way, and also to predict, formulate hypotheses, and then test them. It also, of course, holds the promise of control and systematic innovation. The second point I want to make here is something that is very peculiar, I think, about the famous essay by Francis Crick, in which he formulated the central dogma, namely that he already quite clearly formulated it in terms of sequence information passed on from DNA to RNA to proteins. And I think that these proteins form sequences remains something that is quite unique for them, and invites all the powerful textual metaphors that people have been talking, within which people have been talking. And of course, most importantly, it invites the application of bioinformatic tools. So I think these two reasons explain why genetics has enjoyed a privileged status in the 20th century. Okay, I leave it there, and thank you very much.